Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, protecting South Africa's endangered species, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Lorraine Doyle. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Lorraine, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Rob. It's great to be able to present today on what is actually kind of World Endangered Species Day. For observant listeners, you will see that I've actually changed the title to Protecting South Africa's Threatened Species from Endangered, and I will explain as I go why I've done that. And it is linked to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN's classification of threatened species around the globe. And endangered is one of those criteria that has a very specific set of objectives or a specific paradigm. And so I decided that in order to be scientifically correct, that I would change it to threatened species, but still acknowledging that it is Endangered Species, World Endangered Species Day today. So just a little bit about myself. I think a number of guests have traveled with me in Southern Africa, so they know about me from a expedition leader and a guiding perspective. But essentially, I wear two caps, and the other cap is, so I'm an environmental scientist, and I work on a reserve in South Africa, where I work as the wildlife manager and essentially as the conservation biologist. And so it's with that hat on, I guess, today that I'm looking at the presentation on our threatened species within the Southern African subregion. And there's two species there that we will touch on today, one being rhino, a white rhino, and the other one being a cheetah. And so, yeah, that will be part and parcel of what we look at during the course of this presentation. So don't sign out immediately, because there's things in the first part that look a little bit like scientific diagrams or graphs. They really are just there to give some sort of context to what we're talking about when we look at threatened species, whether that's a global on a global perspective, or whether it's on a more regional perspective, in this instance, a Southern African perspective. And it's really important that we kind of have those data in order to understand, in the true sense of the word, what it is that we are actually dealing with, if we are going to be able to put any sort of conservation initiatives into play. And I talk about conservation, not preservation. So we can't preserve anything, perhaps other than things like jams or pickles, because preservation means that you are keeping something in a steady state, and that is not something that really applies to the natural sciences. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to conserve, which may seem like semantics, but from a scientific perspective, there's actually quite a significant difference. So this set of circles that you see, it's just looking at what proportions of species within South Africa in particular here are potentially threatened with extinction. So the big circle shows all the species in that group. The smaller circle shows how many are endemic. So when we talk about endemism, we're talking about something that occurs nowhere else on Earth. So, for example, if you look at plants, we have over 13,500 endemic plants in South Africa. So those are plants that occur nowhere else on the planet. And so it's looking at what are the potential for these endemics as well, for the possibility of extinction. And it's looking based on a number of the different criteria that the IUCN use. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them. But what you can see is that there are a number of things here that perhaps we generally just don't think about. Some of those being things like amphibians and reptiles. We tend to always think about the furry, the cute, or the scary, but there are many other elements of an ecological system that are vital to essentially survival because of the whole concept of biodiversity. And so that was really just why I wanted to highlight that, this is looking at all those elements, taking them all into account, when we start thinking about how do we look at the bigger picture when we talk about conservation within a region. So what are the most pressing threats? Now, obviously, this is subjective, and this is my perception of what, if somebody were to say to me, what do I think the most pressing threats are to biodiversity and in South Africa, and these would be the ones that I guess I would pull out as the top ones. So loss of habitat, alien invasive species. So those are both plant and animals that have come in from an external place. Many of them in southern Africa come from the neotropics, so southern Central America. They do well here because it's a very similar environment for them, but they don't have any competition, and so they very often will outcompete our native species. And there are many of these that pose challenges to conservation of species within southern Africa. Then poaching, so that is essentially the illicit killing of animals, and strangely, we tend to think of it only as being animals, but plants like cycads, for example, which are highly sought after, when those are removed from the wild without any sort of permission, that's also considered a poaching event. And then one that often doesn't really get onto the radar, but one that does pose significant problems to many of our species is actually the exotic pet trade. And we'll talk about a couple of species that fall into that as we go through this webinar. So I don't want to dwell too much on all of these graphs, but I just wanted to be able to contextualize things. And this is just a graphic of some of what I was saying just now. And as you can see, 45.9% of the threats to biodiversity in Africa is from changes in land use, habitat loss, degradation, and then you go into things like species exploitation, invasive species, and then you get into things like pollution and climate change. So as you can see there, habitat loss is one of the major drivers behind the endangerment of species, not only in Southern Africa, but across the globe. So when we talk about biodiversity, really all I want you to take away from this slide is that biodiversity is something that is crucial if we're looking at conservation in the 21st century. So historically, when we spoke about conservation, we were very much engaged in individual species conservation. So we would conserve pandas or rhinos or elephants. And while that's well and good, what we actually need to be looking at is we need to look at what makes that system as stable and sustainable as it can be. And that is the combination of all of the biotic and the abiotic, so the living and the non-living elements of any system. And so this is just saying, in summary, that if we look between 1980 and what they're looking here at 2100, mammals in southern Africa are potentially showing the greatest loss, birds the least, and then you have things like amphibians and reptiles and plants in between. And then it's giving you an overall index, and there's a number of these indices that are utilized. But just so that you can get a grasp that if we look at this from a holistic perspective, from 1980 even until now, there's obviously, or a very obvious decline in overall biodiversity across southern Africa. And again, this is just looking at what's happened to habitat. Some of it is cropland related, built up, so that's now looking at the expansions of cities, a certain amount of plantation. So when we're looking at monocultures, things like palm nut oil and all of those, and then mining. So mining is something in Africa that, especially the proliferation of open cast mining, is certainly a threat to many of our species on the subcontinent. And then invasive alien species, again, just looking at, so this was actually working on numbers of published studies against it. But as you can see, things like plants, trees, shrubs, grasses, many of those are our biggest invasive aliens. But then we also have things like fish, and a certain number of invasive mammals, and so on. So all of these potentially pose a threat to our species, and specifically certain of our species within South Africa. So I mentioned poaching, and this was just quite a nice graphic of what is being trafficked. And I mean, this is only looking from 2015 to 2021, but I would suggest, certainly based on the knowledge that I have of what's happening with animal trafficking and poaching in Southern Africa, rhino and pangolin being at the top of that is certainly something that is still absolutely relevant currently. When we look at elephants, that's more of a challenge in East Africa, less so in Southern Africa. And then you sort of go down into some of the other species that very often, in the case of snakes, seahorses, tortoises, parrots, those things are all entering the exotic pet trade. So the one that we face an enormous challenge with in Africa as a whole is rhino poaching. And this is something that has been going on for many, many, many decades. But it saw a spike, as you can see here, in the mid around 2015 through 2018. It is still high. We have managed to get it under some level of control, but we are still losing a significant number of our rhinos, both black and white, to poaching for horn. And when we look at what we can do about this and what we are doing to try and conserve our species, you will see that one of the things that we are doing is actually dehorning our rhinos in order to try and protect them from poaching. And then this was just a very brief look at what is happening in the exotic pet trade. And interestingly, things that go into the exotic pet trade that are native species to southern Africa, the largest percentage of that is reptiles. So snakes, certain lizards, one of which I will show you some pictures of just now. So yeah, the reptile trade out of southern Africa is really, really quite substantial. When you get further north and into Central Africa, it starts becoming more bird related. And there are some mammals, southern African mammals, entering the exotic pet trade, but it's less of an issue than the exotic pet trade is for our reptile species in particular. Okay, so if we just have a look at some of the species that have been directly involved in some way, shape, or form with a level of conservation. These are the species that I'll essentially highlight to you this evening, and we'll look at, well, what is it that we can do to try and help conserve these species. So cheetah, so this is there are more than one species of cheetah. There are a few hundred individuals possibly left in Iran, but this particular one is the one that you would see when you come to Africa. This is Asionyx jubatus. And if we just look at the total number of cheetah in the world, we're thinking now in 2025, we're probably talking at about 6,500 mature individuals. So the top 10 countries I've listed there. So South Africa has between 1,200, 1,500. So these essentially are both free roaming cheetahs and cheetahs that are what we call managed wild. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But as you can see, Namibia still has the largest population, and many of Namibia's cheetahs are still completely free roaming. Then Botswana, South Africa, and then you could essentially go down the list as you get further to the bottom of the top 10. So rhinos, so this is something that as well, I've spent a lot of time being directly involved with rhino conservation. So these are white rhinos in this picture, actually wide or square-lipped rhinos. So these are grazing rhinoceros. And then this is a black rhino or a hook-lipped rhino. So these are the rhinos that browse, much more elusive, much more threatened, considered critically endangered in the wild. And to give you an idea why, if we look at a historical rhino population graph, so back in the late 1970s, there were close on 40,000 black rhinos left in the wild, and that then plummeted right the way down to about 2,500, and through a number of initiatives, one of which two of which actually I will briefly discuss with you this evening, we've managed to get that population back to about 6,500. And then white rhinos, again, we have started to see an upturn in the population, and it seems to have stabilized. But both of these problems were created primarily through the poaching of rhino for their horn. So if you look back at rhino populations as well, back well into the 1930s, 1940s, these animals would have been in the hundreds of thousands. A lot of what happened to decimate the population back in the day was actually hunting, big game hunters, who were taking many animals in any given hunt, combined with poaching for horn, for medicinal and other uses, is what led us to the situation that we found ourselves in the 1970s, and which has been an ongoing process to try and re-establish populations ever since. So pangolins, so this is a Temminck's ground pangolin. It's the most widespread pangolin in Africa. And again, another animal that has become vulnerable on the IUCN's list because of poaching for its scales, which are used again in medicinal and other remedies in the East. And so there are a number, there's 8 extant pangolin species across the globe. But yeah, the Temminck's ground one is the only one that I have certainly ever encountered, and one which is incredibly difficult to find in the wild, but nonetheless is endangered purely because of a need, a perceived need for its scales, which are compressed hair. They're exactly the same as your hair and your fingernails. They're all keratin, the same as rhino horn. They have no use to anything other than a pangolin. And in the case of rhino horn, there is no use for rhino horn except to a rhino. So I said that a number of our reptiles are under threat, and this one in particular, a sungazer lizard, this is largely habitat loss that is endangering it. It occurs in a very small area within South Africa. It's a grassland species, so habitat loss is its main danger, but also the exotic pet trade. Because it looks a little bit like the dragon from Tolkien's The Hobbit. It's actually known, its scientific name is Smorg giganteus, so named after Smorg in The Hobbit. So yeah, has been put into the pet trade. They do not breed in captivity. They do not do well in captivity. And as a result of the combination of the exotic pet trade and also loss of habitat, they have now been classified as endangered. So the IUCN has what is known as this red list with all of these criteria on it. And there are a number of different ways of arriving at where on a list like this a species is positioned. I'm not going to go into it, but it includes things like loss of habitat and the like. So in this case, that in particular is one of the biggest drivers of its decline. And then something that I wanted to include here, not because it's something that I have a great deal of knowledge or experience in terms of conservation of, but simply because very often these creatures are completely overlooked. Like I said, they don't really fit into the cute and furries. And so they are consequently quite neglected, and yet they are incredibly important ecosystem indicators and critical to the overall health of environments. And so just something that I just wanted to put on here so that people have some level of awareness that these creatures are endangered and in some cases critically endangered and do require our protection. And the species that I'd listed there, so the one at the top is a frog called it's a kloof frog. The one at the bottom that's sort of that beautiful pinky color, that's a Table Mountain ghost frog. And then the little one, or the greenish one on the side, that's a Pickersgill tree frog. And if we look at how they are listed by the IUCN, you can see that they're endangered, the kloof frog, and the other two are critically endangered. So one step away from being considered extinct in the wild. Okay, so that's all of the not so great news. Those are the challenges. Those are the things that pose the biggest challenges to us as conservationists trying to work in conserving these species. So what are our possible solutions? And again, like I said, with the challenges, the possible solutions as well are subjective. These are my opinions. But for me, there's four of them. Range expansion management, and I'll explain to you now what I mean by that. The rehabilitation and rewilding of species, monitoring and protection, and collaborative partnerships. So the next few slides that I'll take you through kind of show a combination of these based on primarily on projects that I've got some experience of working with in South Africa. So the first one, looking at cheetahs. So the Endangered Wildlife Trust is an organization that was founded in South Africa in the 1970s. Its emblem is actually a cheetah paw print, and it was one of the initial species that the Endangered Wildlife Trust worked towards conserving. And so the cheetah range expansion project is something where within Southern Africa, particularly within private reserves, what happens is we manage all of our cheetahs as one large metapopulation. And the reason for doing that is several-fold. Cheetahs have got one additional problem, in addition to things like habitat loss and all of those issues, and that is a genetic bottleneck or a number of bottlenecks that have happened in the last 100,000 years within cheetahs' genetics. And as a result of that, there is a very narrow gene pool within the cheetah population. And that creates its own set of problems in terms of vulnerability to disease. Some cheetahs now being born with kinks in their tail, which you would think is probably not that big of a problem until you've watched a cheetah hunt and you see how it uses its tail as a rudder. And so what we're trying to do is we actually move cheetahs around between reserves within South Africa and also within Southern Africa, so going up into places like Malawi, to try and get as much genetic diversity as we can within cheetah populations to keep them as healthy as we possibly can. So that's one element. So the other I mentioned was rehabilitation and rewilding. And so we work in association with, and in this instance, the veterinary clinics that we work with is where I'm based in Zululand. And that is when we have injured priority species like this, is that we then treat them and rehabilitate them so that we can then release them back into the wild. So we put them into holding bomas. A boma is purely an enclosure where we temporarily will keep an animal while it is injured, or if it is being translocated from another reserve, where we let it habituate to its environment before we release it. So what we also have is we have certain situations, and this female in particular, an incredibly good cheetah mom, but has couldn't carry well or to term, if you will, in the wild. She would get to about 2 months in her 3 month long pregnancy, and she would start to rapidly lose condition. And so what we found with her is that she actually had a torn or a weakened uterine ligament, and so she couldn't carry to term and hunt. So what we did was we actually placed her into a holding boma. She had her cubs, and she's had several litters in a boma. We keep them there until the cubs are about 3 months old, which is when they would naturally start exploring with mum, and then we release them. And she has done incredibly well like this. She's raised a number of litters to adulthood as a result. And so it's those sorts of interventions that do make a difference. And we've shown that cheetahs, even if they are born and raised for the first few months of their life in an enclosure, still have absolutely no problem in adapting to being wild cheetahs once released. So, sorry, these photographs were actually taken out of video clips because the videos didn't want to play on my machine. But ASHIA is another cheetah conservation organization who has become incredibly good at rewilding cheetahs. And this cheetah female we received a couple of months ago. And her story is incredible in that her grandmother was a captive bred cheetah. So at some point, people used to think that cheetahs made good pets. They don't. And so her grandmother was raised 100% in captivity. She was not a wild cheetah. Her mother was a rewilded cheetah. And she now, as the granddaughter, is essentially a completely wild-born cheetah. She was purely in a holding boma here for a month while she was adapting to the environment because she'd come from another reserve. And this was her a couple of days ago. She's about 18 months old. In the bottom picture, she had just eaten an impala, which is why she looks so incredibly fat. But an incredible success story, especially for ASHIA, in that they had managed to take a captive bred cheetah and within 2 generations had got them to having completely wilded, born and raised cubs, which, yeah, is an extraordinary achievement. So monitoring of animals is key when we're looking at these species which are threatened. I know for many guests, seeing collars on animals when they're on safari is not really something they want to see. But I think if people understand the scientific initiative and the importance behind it, I would hope that it makes sense. It's really important with these animals that we know what's happening to them. Where are they? What are they doing? Are they healthy, or do they need our help? And so monitoring is key in all of these species that we've been talking about. So black rhino, so the hook-lipped rhino that we were speaking of, one of the projects that I've been actively involved with is the World Wildlife Fund's Black Rhino Range Expansion Project. And so this project was designed, it actually was thought or initiated by a South African vet by the name of Dr. Jacques Flamont. And what they did was they took a founder population of black rhinos from a reserve within South Africa, and they gave them to private reserves like the one I'm based on. And it works that every second calf that is born to a female of that founder population that reached 5 years of age would belong to the private reserve. The first offspring would belong to the state, and they would then be able to relocate those rhinos to other reserves in Africa where they had managed to create safe spaces. And so this was actually from a 2017 relocation that we did on the reserve I'm based. So this animal has simply been darted. In this picture is being loaded into a crate. And this animal actually was ultimately translocated to a reserve in Malawi. Did incredibly well. His mum was a very cheeky rhino. And when we got the first photographs of this rhino from Malawi, it had been taken from monitors who had been put up in trees, and they were taking because that's what his mom did. She used to chase people up trees. And so he relocated really well, and he is still on the reserve in Malawi. So this is a white rhino, or a square-lipped rhino. And as you can see, this rhino has had the vast majority of its horn removed. And this is part of the process that we are involved with, working with organizations. One we work with in South Africa is called Project Rhino. And the reason for doing this is to try and stop these rhinos being slaughtered for their horn. So when we take the horn, we take it from 4 fingers above the growth plate. It is exactly the same as cutting your fingernails. It regrows. We have to do this procedure every 2 years. But it really is one of the only ways we have found that we are able to protect these animals from being poached for their horn, for, as I say, medicinal uses. It goes for approximately $100,000 per kilogram. And a rhino with a big horn has probably got about $500,000 on its face. And for that, these animals are being killed. And so as I say, one of the few ways that we have found is to actually remove the horn. So you can see here in that picture, it's quite interesting, their cuticle almost is, ours are half moon shaped, theirs are almost heart shaped, but you can see that it's compressed hair. You can actually see the hair there. And once we've removed it, we remove it with a reciprocating saw. We then use an angle grinder just to grind off the edges. We then treat it with hoof oil, just a bit like cuticle oil. And it then grows back as a perfectly normal horn over the period of over 2 years. What we've also done on our rhinos is we have put ankle collars on them. So these collars track their movements. These ones have a solar panel on them. And so we can know where our rhinos are at any given point in time. We also get alerts if something in their behavior pattern changes. So all part of monitoring to help us look after these animals that are in our custody. And so this is just to show you that the animal that was down there had plugs in its ears and a blindfold on and all of those things. This is when we finished working on the animal. This is like 15 minutes after the drugs have been reversed and the animal has been woken up. And to all intents and purposes, obviously, yes, over time, undoubtedly, we will see challenges or issues related to the fact that they don't have a horn. They don't use it for anything in particular, so not like elephant tusks. They don't use it for digging and those sorts of things. But rhinos have horns for a reason, And so we can be in no doubt that there are ramifications for taking the horn, but at the moment, at least, we still have the species in existence. So it's kind of the lesser of two evils. There is research being done on it. We have seen some changes in the size of territories in dehorned rhinos and so on, but nothing that at this point has given us enough cause for alarm that we think it warrants stopping it. The other thing is, so this again involves the rehabilitation of animals. So this little baby rhino was born prematurely. He was injured. He had a nasty wound on his leg. And as a result, we put him and his mum into a holding boma. We kept them there for approximately 3 months. And the little chap is now out and about and doing absolutely fine. He's completely healed, and he and mum are now back out in the main reserve. So this was just to show you some of the collaborations that exist amongst other, when we look at other species that we've spoken about, things like pangolins. So there's a number of different organizations. I've done some work with the Zululand Conservation Trust. This pangolin kept going walkabout. He kept leaving the reserve where he was based. And so they're nocturnal. We would have to go and look for him in the middle of the night, put him in a shopping bag and carrying him down a mountain to send him home. So they have tracking tags on them as well to help us with relocating them and making sure that their welfare is looked after. So this, like I said in the beginning, this is not something that really I have been that actively involved with in terms of amphibian or even to that extent reptile rehabilitation or conservation. But this is just to give you an idea that organizations like the Endangered Wildlife Trust work across a multiplicity of platforms and species. And so this is work that they've been doing, looking specifically at threatened amphibian species. So you can see there the kleur frog, the reed frog I spoke about earlier. And so this comes back down to the whole concept of collaboration between organizations. And so this is just really sort of as a final slide. These are the organizations that I have been actively involved with, working alongside to do what we can to try and protect these species in some meaningful way. And as you will see, many of them are NPOs. And so it really is about forming these collaborative networks that enable us to do the work that needs to be done in order to protect South Africa's, in this instance, South Africa's threatened species, and a mere handful of them. But these are the ones that I know intimately, that I've been involved with. And so those are really the only ones that I can talk to with any sort of level of authority or veracity. So that's all of the presentation, Rob. I'm very happy to try and answer any questions people may have. So yeah, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lorraine. Now, before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. So just go to the upper right-hand corner of your control panel, click on those 3 lines on the top right corner, and then you can scroll down to the question bar and throw your questions in there. So let's get to some of these questions. Can you explain, or is there a reason for that distinctive black eye line that radiate downwards from a cheetah's eyes? Is that camouflage, or is that just one particular animal?
No, so all cheetahs have those. They're often described as tear marks, and what we think. So all of these things, it's basically our best hypothesis. But cheetahs are diurnal predators, so they hunt during the day. And if you look at things like lions or leopards, which are nocturnal, they have white under their eyes, which allows for the more reflection of light into their eyes. So with cheetahs, it's the opposite. It helps absorb light. So when they're hunting during the day, it's a bit like them having the equivalent of sunglasses. It's just absorbing some of that reflective radiation so that it doesn't blind them when they're trying to hunt.
Great. Thank you so much. So, dehorning and monitoring must be an expensive and labor-intensive process. Is there any other way that they have found that's been effective to prevent poaching, hiring more rangers to patrol the preserves? Is that an option, or have they found that dehorning is the best way to go?
So we also, on all of these reserves, all of the reserves have got quite extensive anti-poaching units, armed anti-poaching units. So that was the kind of initial first line of defense. In some reserves, they have had moderate success with that. We found in the area that I'm based in Zululand that it wasn't enough. And so in conjunction with that, the decision was made back in 2016 to start dehorning rhinos. When that still wasn't enough, that's when we started putting ankle bracelets on them to try and monitor them even more closely. Um, and so really it it it's just a combination of things that we found that seems to work. Um, I would absolutely love not to have to dehorn rhinos, but the reality at the moment is that for the foreseeable future, certainly in this part of the world, we're going to have to continue to do it in order to protect them. And yes, it is costly, it's time consuming, and it's something I absolutely hate doing because it's defacing an animal. But it really has proven to be the most effective way in combination with having armed rangers and now tracking devices as well to keep them safe.
Great. Thank you for giving us some more information on that. Can you talk a little bit more about the African pangolin working group? Is it just in South Africa, or does it cover more countries than that? And can you talk a little bit about what they're doing to preserve them?
Yeah, so the African Pangolin Working Group, it was established in South Africa in 2011. Um, they are doing work further afield. Um, Most recently, they've actually just in the last few months on a place in South Africa called Lapalala Wilderness. They've actually opened a specialist facility for the treatment because what happens with these pangolins is they get rescued from the trade. So often they get them as live pangolins, which have obviously been severely traumatized by the conditions that they've been exposed to and kept in. And so what they do is they then work with them, they have specialist vets, they rehabilitate them. Um, they also, for example, the Zululand Conservation Trust also does work with pangolins um, in this particular area where I'm based. And you have people who you can come and volunteer to work with them. You actually have specialist pangolin walkers who start rehabilitating them by taking them for walks. And so it really is, from having a pangolin that's been rescued from the trade to being a wild pangolin again, can take many, many, many months. And so it's quite an expansive process. Work is being done in other countries in Africa as well, through the African Pangolin Group. So I know they're working in places like Zimbabwe, and I think Zambia as well, maybe also Namibia. So yeah, working across a broader area, but essentially are working with these animals that are rescued from the trade.
Great. Thank you for providing some more information on that. We do appreciate it. So, is plant poaching an issue? And do we know what happens to plants after they've been poached? I know, are they able to be returned?
Yeah, look, it's so cycads in particular are some of the biggest problem plants being taken out of the wild in South Africa. So obviously cycads are extremely ancient plants. They're gymnosperms, so produce these amazing cones. Um, what's happened in some of our botanical gardens, just to contextualize it in South Africa, they've actually had to put them into protected areas, and they put chips. They actually microchip them. So they were microchipping them out in the wild, but what they found is that when people would come in, believe it or not, sometimes by helicopter, they would remove these plants. What they would then do is take them, have them x-rayed so that they could find the chips, and then remove the chips so that these plants couldn't be traced. So it really is an ongoing challenge. And one of the ways is by, in a crazy situation, actually putting them into protected areas that are almost guarded, for want of a better expression. But yes, many of them, unfortunately, they get sold to private collectors for huge amounts of money, and they never get retrieved or returned to the wild. So yeah, it is a significant problem. And yeah, it's one where there's ongoing work, but we don't have a particularly good solution currently.
Great. Okay. Thank you for talking about that. So, what is the conservation status of giraffes in South Africa?
So giraffes. So obviously, in recent times there's been quite a lot of discussion around giraffes and the number of different species of giraffe. There's been some taxonomic changes to giraffe. So at present, within South Africa, the species, the South African giraffe that we have here, is a species of what we would call least concern, based on the IUCN red list. But certainly there are other species of giraffe, things like reticulated giraffe and a number of others, that are certainly endangered, but not within the sort of southern African subregion. So our giraffe populations are relatively stable. And so there's not an extensive amount of work being done on them in South Africa presently, but certainly further north of us, there definitely is more work being done on giraffe conservation.
Gotcha. Thank you. So, what would you recommend to people and to business owners? What can we do to help protect endangered species?
So I mean, I think awareness is a huge one, particularly when it comes to things like plants or having exotic pets. People just realizing that it's not cool to have those. some of the big problems you have in the States, for example, in the Florida Everglades, have been caused by people bringing in exotic pets, finding that they can't look after, a python, once a Burmese python in this case, once it gets to adulthood, and then just releasing it, and then causing all these sorts of problems that you now have, in the Everglades in Florida, for example. So I think that's one element, and then I think the other is just being aware of reputable NPOs, that are doing good work in specific areas and being able to support those. And that's one thing that Natural Habitat does, certainly through WWF. As I say, that in Southern Africa, the Black Rhino Range Expansion Project is one, where funding directly from, NatHab guests will be going, for people who are coming to Southern Africa. So I think just finding out as well before people do give, or get involved in any sort of, donations to these types of organizations, just making sure that they're reputable, because there's particularly, around rhinos, there was a number of organizations that got established that were, certainly, they were fronts, and it was really nothing was actually going to rhino conservation. So I think just awareness, and doing your homework, if people are going to, be kind enough to assist in some way. Um, Also, many of these organizations, will have, opportunities for people to volunteer. And again, provided that that is done in an ethical manner, it's another way of raising awareness, and also raising funds.
Lorraine, thank you so much for that advice. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, just to say thank you, for this opportunity to present, and yeah, also just to thank NatHab, guests for listening, and also for, whether it's indirectly, but being part of these conservation initiatives through the work of WWF. And thanks, yeah, for the opportunity to share.
And Lorraine, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel to South Africa with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.